So I'll just read this to everyone quickly and then we'll go through it. And it begins, Om, God is perfectly whole, and because God is perfectly whole, all that emanate from God, such as this phenomenal reality, are perfectly sustained as perfectly whole. Okay. Whatever is formed of the perfect God is also perfect in itself. Because God is the complete whole, even though so many beings emanate from God, God remains still the complete balance. Okay, so as people who were here last time know, we spent the entire hour and a half basically just going through about half of this verse. But again, we'll just spend maybe just a few minutes going through the rest of it. And as far as the second half of this verse, there are several things that are of importance. First, the idea, the concept, that all things that exist in reality have God as its source. Now, you've heard me repeat this many times in the past, in the Bhagavad Gita class, other classes as well. Well, this verse confirms this, but goes a little bit deeper into explaining what precisely does that mean. That all things, all beings, all animate beings, but also even inanimate matter, quite literally everything that exists, has God as its source, as its origin. Originally, and when we say originally, this is where it gets tricky. We have to keep in mind that we are using vocabulary that has to do with time to try to explain something that is beyond time. Okay? So when I say originally, what does that mean in the context of eternity? It doesn't mean something temporal. It means something ontological. Okay? It means one of philosophical and being dependency. Okay, so I'll use this word. Originally, all that exists is God. Okay? Originally. Now, again, when I say originally, I'm not talking about a time sequence. It's not that there was necessarily a time in which all that there was God and we didn't exist, matter didn't exist, etc. No, what this means, rather, is that God, again, is the foundation of reality. That if all things were to be reduced down to their fundamental building blocks. Now, I remember, when we had our first class, we talked about this fundamental concept of the Upanishads, but also Vedanta. That all of reality, when broken down, really falls under three categories. That being either God, A, or individual souls, B, or matter, which is C. Now, the thing is, all these three things also can be ultimately reduced to God itself, to Brahman itself. Because the latter two, that is individual souls and matter, also do not have independent existence, but rather they have their existence secured by the spiritual fact of God's existence. Okay? We get that? All right. So, this is what is meant by all things emanating from God. It's not that at a certain point in history, 100 billion, zillion, trillion years ago, God said, let me create something other than myself. That's it. Again, it's not talking in a temporal sort of way, but it's hard to even use the term causal sort of way. You can use the word causal. Really, the only way to explain this is, again, one of ontological dependency. Okay? Okay. So, that's the first thing. Second thing is we having emanated from God, God being of the nature of God, which is what? Which is everything. What does it mean for God to be God? It means that there is nothing lacking within God. Okay? Now, ourselves, having emanated from God, there's also nothing lacking within us. Okay? We get that? Except for one thing. And that is dependency upon that which is our origin. Okay? So in other words, this is where we have the dynamic of infinite and finite. This is how we can understand this concept of God being infinite, and what does it mean for anything outside God, quote unquote, to be finite. It means simply one of dependency. It means simply one of one thing has a source, one thing is the source. Okay? So this is how we can have emanated from God. We in ourselves, like God, are complete wholes. We are perfect. The Atman, the self, the true self, is in and of itself already perfect. It has everything that it needs. In quality, in everything that we are non-different from God. Really, if you were to, and of course I'm, using an imperfect example because you can't put God under a microscope, but if you could put a piece of God under a microscope, and if you were to put a piece of us under a microscope, you would see the same thing. You would see the same thing. So as far as quality, as far as substantial makeup, there's no difference. Consciousness is consciousness. Okay? However, what's the difference? The difference is that this is dependent upon this. That this has its origin in this. That this is finite, and due to being finite, has the ability to forget itself. This, that is God, does not. What would happen if God forgot himself? That would be the ultimate horror. It's a horror when we forget ourselves. There are infinite spirits, infinite beings, and each one of us, for each one of us, it is a catastrophe when we forget ourselves. It's a catastrophe when we fall into ignorance and forget what is our true nature. What would it mean for God to forget himself? Reality would cease to exist altogether. Like this funny story of Shiva, and one day Shiva is sitting, and he's just sitting and meditating or doing something, and his consort Parvati comes, and she's just kind of in a funny mood. She is just in a playful mood, and she sneaks up behind Shiva, and she does what a lot of people do when they're being playful. She takes her hands and she covers up his eyes, but when doing that, she made the mistake of also covering up his third eye, and the entire universe went black. The entire universe.
I hate it when that happens.
Oh, you're not alone. Yeah, the entire universe went black.